All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes. That means good afternoon. So my name is Elvia Ramirez, and I'm an associate professor of ethnic studies here at Sac State. I would like to thank you all for joining us today for this amazing panel presentation. This event is sponsored by the Task Force for the Center on Race, Immigration, and Social Justice, or CRISJ. I see some fellow CRISJ members. If any of you are here in the audience, please stand up and let us thank you for all your amazing work. And also a very special thanks to the staff of the Library Art Gallery and also Creative Services, and to Dr. Manuel Barajas, the director of CRISJ, for supporting this event. So the theme of today's panel presentation is Decolonizing Education, Unpacking Inequality Along the Educational Pipeline. So an outstanding group of Sac State faculty, including Drs. Alma Flores, Dr. Nancy Guantes Insun, Dr. Bao Lo, Dr. Andrea Moore, and Dr. Susan Nakaoka will share their research, scholarship, and insights concerning educational inequality. And so after everyone has finished presenting, we'll open it up for a Q&A session. That's question and answer session. So our first presenter is Dr. Alma Itze Flores. Alma Itze Flores is an assistant professor in the College of Education here at Sac State. Born in Jalisco, Mexico, and raised in Santa Barbara, California, Dr. Flores is a proud immigrant and former first-generation college student. She earned her BA in sociology at UCLA, her MA in education at UT Austin, and her PhD in education at UCLA. As a Chicana feminist scholar, her research and teaching interests include the educational experiences of Chicanx Latinx first-generation college students, Chicanx Latinx immigrant families, in particular Chicana Latina mother-daughter pedagogies, and the development and analysis of Chicana Latina feminist pedagogies and research methodologies. She has over 10 years of experience working with students of color and their families. Inspired by communities of color, Dr. Flores' work is guided by a deep commitment to social justice. So everyone, please help me welcome Dr. Alma Flores.
So before we begin, I know I have some of my students here. So to sign in, Tanya, if you can raise in, you'll be checking in with her. All right. So good afternoon. My name's Alma Itze Flores, and I'm a new assistant professor here in the College of Education and Undergraduate Studies. And today I'm actually presenting a co-authored chapter with Tanya Gaxiola Serrano and Daniel Solorzano at UCLA. This is a forthcoming chapter, and the edited volume is It Race or Racism? State of Evidence and Tools for the Public Health Professional. So my presentation is organized in the following way. I'm going to start by talking about the problem we focused on in our chapter, particularly focusing on one study by Gaydal Chanel, and then how as critical race scholars we analyzed and responded to this study. And to do this, I'll focus on discussing the intersection between race, racism, education, and health, with a particular attention to Latinx students. I'll then contextualize this with our current political climate by discussing the Trump effect, and I'll speak more about what we mean by that. And I'll conclude with a discussion on microaffirmations and just some thoughts on how this translates to Sac State. So the problem. So research shows that individuals with more education live healthier and longer lives. People with more education can actually expect to outlive their less educated counterparts by about a decade. But in the chapter, what we're asking ourselves, is this true for everyone? Gaydal Chanel, which is the study that I'll discuss in a bit, found that the health returns from more education are not actually equal for all individuals. Their findings actually show that for Black and Latinx students from, quote, disadvantaged backgrounds, finishing college actually has negative effects on their physical health. And so the problem that we want to, or that we focus on in our chapter, is why is this the case for Black and Latinx students? Why is it that the health returns from an education are not the same, and that we cannot expect to outlive our educated counterparts? So Gaydosh and all, in their study, what they find is that Black and Latinx students face higher level of what they call metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is basically a cluster of conditions that occur together, and it can increase your risk of heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. And so what they find is that Black and Latinx students have higher levels of this metabolic syndrome with a college degree than without one. In contrast, whites from any socioeconomic background, so if we control for class, will enjoy the health benefits associated with a college completion. Black and Latinx students may actually then experience the opposite of either of their white counterparts, where their health suffers due to higher levels of education, suggesting then that educational attainment may actually come at a health cost for some students of color. And so why is this the case, right? So Gaydosh, again, and their colleagues give us some explanations as to what may be the cause of this. And so they explain that when students from, again, quote-unquote, disadvantaged backgrounds achieve upward mobility, they may experience social isolation or have a lack of support in their new socioeconomic status. This environment may be hostile and may be uninviting. They may also feel like their new achieved status is not assured, which can cause them to deploy these strategies that are effective in alleviating mental strife but are harmful for our physical health. This causes a wear and tear impact on their bodily system. So this is, again, Gaydosh and their colleagues, how they explain why this is the case. What is it about education that is having these negative health effects on Black and Latinx students? And so our issue as critical race scholars with Gaydosh and all studies is that they measure disadvantage based on students of color's households, schools, and neighbors. Things such as single-parent family structure, the unemployment rate in the community, proportion of Black residents in a community, proportions of households receiving welfare, even the violent crime rate. These were some of the markers they use to measure disadvantage. And what we find from reading their work is that really there is a downplay of calling out how institutions actually facilitate racism. And again, the blame is put more on individuals rather than on institutions. And so this approach, what we discuss in our chapter, adds to the portrayal of communities of color as places immersed in a culture of poverty. And again, the focus is on individuals rather than on institutions. And so as critical race scholars, we shift the focus to the ways racism is enacted via institutions, like education, by providing a critical race analysis to explain why maybe this disparity exists. And so we approach our analysis specifically through a community cultural wealth framework in which we position and shift the Latinx community as a site of knowledge and strength to actually combat racism rather than a disadvantage to Latinx students. So rather than saying it is our own background that is causing these health disparities, we are placing the blame on institutions. And so we argue that, again, rather than place the blame on students of color, we should shift the focus on how institutions are sites of racism and the physiological and psychological effects that racism has on students of color. And so we suggest that to answer this question of, again, why Latinx students' health suffer due to education, or why Latinx students do not reap the same health benefits from education, we need to begin by first looking at campus racial climate, the campus racial climate of schools and universities specifically. And so campus racial climate examines the overall racial environment of educational institutions. And the racial climate of a campus can be both positive or negative, but it can be assessed using the following criteria. And so we can look at the school's mission and history. And I want us to think about this in the context of Sacramento State. The contemporary socio-political discourse, the infrastructure of the school, school policies and practices, the racial makeup of faculty, students, and administrators, support programs for students, and the classroom curriculum and pedagogy. So if we were to assess the campus racial climate of Sacramento State, these would be some of the things we would look at to determine whether it is a positive or a negative campus racial climate. And from research that we've done, we know that most Latinx students experience a negative campus racial climate, which is a social and academic environment that exhibits and cultivates racial and gender discrimination against people of color. And so again, we're suggesting that to answer this question, we need to look at how institutions are facilitating racism. And Latinx students often experience a negative campus racial climate due to things like racial microaggressions. And racial microaggressions are one form of systemic everyday racism, and they can be subtle, layered, cumulative. They can also be verbal and nonverbal, and they're assaults that are directed at people of color. And this creates anxiety, self-doubt, and really a troubling amount of race-related stress. And for Chicanas and Latinas, we have research that documents some of the more physiological effects that racial microaggressions have. So for Chicanas and Latinas, we've documented that it causes changes in their menstrual cycle and their reproductive experiences, chronic conditions, increased illness, depressed immune systems, and racial battle fatigue. And again, when we think about this, we often think about racial microaggressions as perhaps just a psychological thing. But really, there are these really deep physiological things that maybe are not as visible, but that through research, we've been able to document these physiological effects. And so the accumulation of having to constantly prepare, cope, having to defend against racial microaggressions, people of color are often physically and just emotionally drained, and this is often referred to as racial battle fatigue, what William Smith refers to racial battle fatigue. And some of the physiological symptoms of racial battle fatigue include suppressed immunity, increased sickness, tension headaches, trembling and jumpiness, chronic pain and healed injuries, elevated blood pressure, and a pounding heartbeat. In the anticipation of racial microaggressions, people of color may also experience things like rapid breathing, an upset stomach, or even frequent diarrhea or urination. Other symptoms that have been documented again through research include constant anxiety, ulcers, increased swearing or complaining, insomnia, or sleep broken by haunting, conflicting specific dreams, rapid mood swings, difficulty thinking or speaking coherently, and emotional and social withdrawal. So again, together with campus racial climate, or a hostile campus racial climate, racial microaggressions, racial battle fatigue, these are symptoms of institutional and everyday racism. And so the bodies of Latinx students, and arguably other students of color, become discursive sites where the effects of racism emerge in both psychological and physiological ways. So this can have long-term health consequences. And so in the chapter, we argue that we need to contextualize this problem. The problem is specifically looking at studies that have documented an increase in reports of racist incidents on campus since Trump began his presidential campaign in 2015. Cases such as the one at McDowell High School, this was in North Carolina, where seniors built a wall out of boxes with a sign that said, "We built the wall first." And I'm going to show you a clip of the type of effects this has on students.
That night I was working, and they came in asking for boxes, and I didn't know until the next morning that those kids were the ones that posted that picture.
The wall Trump wants to build will keep people out. But seeing something like it at her high school brings emotions Marta can't keep in.
Because it hurts a lot of people's feelings. They don't know what people really go through to get where they are right now. And some people are privileged to have so much stuff, but some people don't.
The principal met with Marta and the president of the Hispanic Youth Club today to apologize. But the school system says the students who pulled the prank won't be disciplined.
There's not anything offensive in the photo. What became offensive or concerning
Marta is scheduled to have another meeting with the principal on Monday where they can talk about ways to help fix this situation.
Once again, the responsibility to fix or educate others on why this is problematic falls back on students like Martha, on students of color, right? This is not okay. And these are not isolated incidents. We may think of North Carolina as super far from here, super removed from here. This happened at UC San Diego, where the Latino Center was tagged with messages like, build the wall, deport them all. And so it's imperative that we think about how our current political climate, where the Latinx community continues to be vilified by President Trump and his administration, shapes the way Latinx students are experiencing the intersection of education and health. Specifically now, what is the current climate for students who are women or women of color after the Kavanaugh case? And so while the responsibility should not be placed on institutions to support the well-being of Latinx students, we do find that it's important to discuss how microaffirmations are one way students of color respond to racial stress. And microaffirmations are small, brief interactions that make people of color feel acknowledged and valued. In 2015, the portraits of black professors at the Harvard Law School were defaced. Students expressed how this incident was just one illustration of the harmful campus racial climate. And so how the students responded, they placed notes of affirmation and appreciation on the portraits of all the black professors in support of them. And so this is just one example of what a microaffirmation is, how students respond to racial stress and uphold each other. But again, we're not saying that it's the responsibility of students to deal with this, but again, we are always sites of resistance. And so to conclude, I want to think about what we've covered so far. And so when it comes to the health promises of an education, students of color are at a disadvantage, often experiencing a worsening of their health rate rather than an improvement. Using a community cultural wealth approach means shifting the focus from individuals and communities to institutions and structures. And so rather than looking at what communities of color lack, we should ask what can institutions do better. And lastly, I really want us to think about what does this mean at Sac State. So I'm only in my first semester, but something that was quite apparent to me during faculty orientation was the lack of faculty of color. And so we need to do better for the well-being of our students of color, but also for the well-being of ourselves. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Flores, for that amazing presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Nancy Guante Sinsun. Dr. Nancy Guante Sinsun was born in Mexico, but grew up in Stockton, California since the age of 4. Currently, she's a part-time faculty member at Sac State for the Department of Ethnic Studies. She currently also serves as Interim Education Director for Stockton Schools Initiative. And lastly, she sits on the board of the Chicana Collective, as well as the Stockton Urban Revitalization Fellowship. So please help me welcome Dr. Nancy Guante Sinsun.
Well, it's good to see everyone. So like Elvia said, I am a professor here at Sac State. I teach mostly ethnic studies courses. And so today I'm going to be talking about research and basically what scholars are saying about decolonizing research that is impacting the way we think about, move from in educational research in particular. And I came to this conversation through my dissertation. So this is a chapter in my dissertation where I look closely at how Chicana Latina scholars in the field of education negotiate research praxis. And so in this chapter, the testimonio pláticas that I collected along with the selection of text brought together conversations about how we're theorizing about the process of decolonization and how that informs how we approach research, but also how we make sense of the problematics and tropes in research. And some of those tropes really quickly is basically the lack of dialogue and practice among mainstream frames of educational research, like critical qualitative research and critical indigenous methodologies.
Research investment in colonial and imperial frameworks, despite its claim and use of critical methodologies, educational research and practice for the most part still reads, locates, and produces colonial relationships to learning, knowledge, and knowledge production. And then two last ones. Production of research continues to function from an erasing to replace framework rather than a historical memory. And then the last one, research and overall institution of education continues to foster problematic relationships with vulnerable communities that have multiple ramifications for the researcher and the researcher researched, right? And so I want to start my presentation with a poem by Gloria Anzaldúa. So how many of you have read Gloria Anzaldúa, either in previous classes? Okay, awesome. Or on your own. Gloria Anzaldúa was a wonderful Chicana feminist writer. A lot of her work in the 80s and early 90s really expanded the way we thought about the Chicano experience, specifically talking about gender and sexuality. And so today we remember her through this poem called Letting Go. And this is really a reflection on how I felt when I was doing my dissertation, and specifically talking about research, which is a very high contested area, right, in terms of how we decide to collect data. It's not enough deciding to open. You must plunge your fingers into your navel with your two hands split open. Spell out the lizards and horned toads, the orchids and the sunflowers. Turn the maze inside out. Shake it, yet you don't quite empty. Maybe a green phlegm hides in your cough. You may not even know that there is something still there until a knot grows in your throat and turns into a frog. It tickles a secret smile on your plate full of tiny orgasms, but sooner or later it reveals itself. The green frog indiscreetly croaks. Everyone looks up. That is research. The end. I'm just kidding. And so really that is, on this slide you'll see different forms of like how we express decolonization. So if you've heard or seen the memes on social media, or professors talk about, we're going to decolonize our syllabus, decolonize our mind, decolonize education, decolonize our research. So what is that buzzword? Where is it coming from when it comes to research, right? And so in thinking about all these definitions, I first want to talk to you about how I came to even be a nerd about research praxis. I was in grad school, and so I worked heavily with different university school community partnerships. The programs, they were empowering, refreshing. They were an opportunity for everyone who was part of the university to practice our pedagogy, reflect how we live theory. However, part of this reflection process also shed light on the contradictions of doing some of these types of works or programs during our conferences and university-related activities. So questions that were raised for me were, who owns research? Who or what benefits from the exposure and knowledge produced within these types of collective work? A key component of these questions is, what does it mean to do research with communities of color, with whom the researcher shares attributes such as race, gender, language, etc.? So when I started to look deeper into these questions, I came across research that spoke to decolonization as a process in which we can approach research. More specifically, I read the scholarship which talked about decolonizing research that invites folks to conceptualize their own experience as a researcher of color, as a woman of color, and the different methodological shifts. I became very interested in exploring the questions that I talked about earlier, and also in the frameworks that basically asked us to take very deep pauses about educational research. And so some of the definitions that you see up here were introduced in an article by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, who spoke about decolonization is not a metaphor. That's what the article is called. How many of you have read that article piece? We need to assign this article. Not only because it's an important thought process, but because it really asks us to reflect the terminology and the language that we use when it comes to social justice work and what the actual process looks like, right? So terms like decolonize our schools, decolonize our methods, those usually turn, according to Tuck and Yang, decolonization into a metaphor. They further explain how approaches that decenter settler perspectives have objectives that are incommensurable. I'm an English language learner, y'all. With decolonization because of the history of settler colonialism. So it is easy to reproduce that very praxis that educators are trying to decenter. So they continue to talk about how this metaphorization of decolonization makes possible a set of settler moves to innocence. In other words, Tuck and Yang explain how the metaphor secures colonial structures. The article examines how these moves and makes suggestions on making room for meaningful potential alliances that unsettle these moves into innocence. So, after reading that very complex article, I'm like, what do I do with this? Because I'm in grad school, I need to pick a topic. And I'm super nerdy about research itself. I decided to think about or place in conversation Tuck and Yang with Chicana feminists and how we do research and how we approach decolonization. And so after reading Tuck and Yang and other scholars within Chicana feminists, anti-colonial and queer of color critique, who too decenter settler perspectives and colonialism, I knew I wanted to examine deeper how Chicana Latina scholars define decolonization and their definition and how their definition influenced how they approached and made sense of their praxis and their own positionality. So on this slide, you will see the scholarship that I am in conversation with and that until this day challenges my thinking and my approach to my teaching, my own research. The readings coupled with the testimonio pláticas that I collected contribute to the untangling, the decentering of settler colonial perspective as it relates to education and our own educational research, as well as the continued process for scholars of color who go through and trouble and reflect the disembodied nature of research. So today, the next couple slides only focus on the first question, right? What methodological tools are available for decolonial strategies within our institutions? And how do we navigate those as Chicana feminists in our work? So in unpacking, or when I looked at the literature, I became intrigued in how many times there were references to understand the university as a colonial project, and how systemically, although researchers were engaging in critical research or social justice research, there was still a large conversation on how they negotiated between dichotomous lines of research, such as researcher, subject, academia, community, activism, scholarship, colonized, colonizer. The other major takeaway was how and with who they theorized decolonization. For example, you have Emma Perez, who talked about reimagining history through a decolonial imaginary. You had Chela Sandoval, who spoke about unsettling binaries using differential oppositional consciousness in both pedagogy and methodology. You also have Maria Lugones, along with others who speak about continuously reflecting on heterosexualism and colonial modern systems of gender. Through a decolonial feminism perspective, you have Sandra Soto, who talks about the process of demastering or demastery of desire as a framework of explaining racialized sexuality within the Mexican culture. Also, we have Sofia Villenas, who theorized her position as a Chicana ethnographer and who asked researchers to go beyond their colonizer position by looking within their own research positionality. So these frameworks suggest that we can think of decolonial moments or possibilities to produce and interrupt these binaries. They also examine how engaging with decolonial moments in the indigena mestiza way is an opportunity to create an understanding of that in which space in colonial decolonial process and history, as well as other fields such as education. However, this conceptualization of decolonization through a Chicana Latina feminist lens runs the risk of maintaining colonial structures and practices. So how do conversations about decolonization shape and interrogate critical qualitative research, praxis, and education? So I won't go into, because I only have 5 minutes because I talk a lot. I asked the participants, so I interviewed or I took away 7 testimonio pláticas, 8 with myself. And this is one of the questions that I asked them, and particularly looking at decolonization and research praxis. And so I drew focus on this because I was just interested in seeing if what we were saying matched what Tuck and Yang was saying, or if there was like a gray area where we went back and forth. It turns out we're really messy. We agree with Tuck and Yang. For some of the Testimonio Plática participants, they don't like to use the word decolonization in their work. They believe that there are, like I said, decolonial moments and opportunities to take deep pauses and reflect in our research, but they do not see, and they want us to be very cautious about how we use the term and how we engage the term to claim our research has now decolonized an area. So that is the major takeaway. The literature in Testimonio Pláticas offered a complicated discussion that pushes researchers to question our different forms of consciousness that may reflect colonial and imperial frameworks. So the way that I saw it was like, Nancy, you need to get it together and figure out, like, can I move deeper from where I'm at, right? What are some contradictions that I have as a researcher? Now that I've gotten a PhD, how will I use this platform as a way to bring justice to some of the inequalities that I see in education? The answer is not very clear, right? Which is why I'm still working in the community and teaching part-time because I can't make up my mind. It's not very easy. And so I commend those who are in the university and are doing both of those things while at the university because it's a very tough process. We go in through a lot of conversations within ourselves about the work that we do and always questioning like the unpacking of decolonization. So I'm going to end there just to give an honor time to the rest of the presenters. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nancy Huantesinsun. That was a very insightful analysis. Our next presenter is Dr. Bao Lo. Dr. Bao Lo is assistant professor here at Sac State in the Department of Ethnic Studies. Her research interests include U.S. immigration with a focus on the second generation, that's the children of post-1965 immigrants, race and ethnicity, and Asian Americans with a specialization in Hmong Americans. She served as director of the Ethnic Studies program and vice chair of the President's Commission on Diversity and Inclusion at California State University, Stanislaus. She has published on second-generation Hmong Americans in the Journal of Southeast Asian American Education and Advancement and Amerasia Journal. She's currently co-editing an anthology for Hmong American Studies, and she is 1.5 generation Hmong American and also grew up in Stockton. Please help me welcome Dr. Bao Lo.
Okay, thank you. Wow, this room is packed. Good afternoon. Are you well? Yes. Great. Thank you, and thank you for the welcome. Thank you for having this panel. I'm very excited, the fact that we're talking about this topic. It's my first semester too, as Alma said earlier. It's very exciting because Sacramento's, sort of my second home, even though I grew up in Stockton. So it's really exciting to be back here. And for this topic or panel, I couldn't think of anything else but to talk about ethnic studies, because we are decolonizing education from the forefront, from the beginning. And that's why my topic is about the Ethnic Studies Project. It's not new. It's something that we continually do and fight for in the university. And so I wanted to address this issue of student activism in higher education, because we wouldn't be here without that. That's the roots, the core of that. And I'm going to use the topic of the Northridge protests to address this issue and to really give you a critical sense of the fact that it's been seen out of context, historical context. It's not just their fight, it's our fight. And so we're going to begin that conversation. Hopefully we leave today with you thinking more that we need to have more conversation about this, right? Okay. Great. So some questions that I want us to focus on or think about during my talk is the question of what is or should be the role of ethnic studies and student activism in higher education. And what do you know or understand about the student protests at CSU Northridge? So I actually want you to talk with people around you for like 1 minute about these two topics, focusing more on number 2, because I want to know largely in this room, do you really know the topic of the protests and what's going on? Because it's not that recent. Okay, let's do that. Okay, let's recenter. Come back. Because I'm on limited time. All right. Before we get to these questions, and it'll be, I said, a unifying theme through my talk, how many of you know about the protests at Northridge and what it's really about? Do you know about it? Oh, wow, look around the room. Wow, no hands except the front. And if you know, do you really know what it's about? A little bit. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do today, give you some context. All right. I think that I want to start with this idea that the Northridge protest is not something that is an isolated event. It's not something that those students are just fighting for because of their own current situation at the university, but it is connected to and rooted to what we fight for in ethnic studies every day. Our mere existence on a university campus is our activism. And the threat to the GE requirements in the multicultural area from the executive order of the chancellor's office is the exact reason why we need to be involved, why we need to have these critical conversations all across the CSUs. So what I'm trying to say is that the protest of Northridge has been taken out of historical context because we need to go back to the roots of ethnic studies to see that they are not just doing this fight as an isolated event. So given the fact that, I'm not going to give you a history lesson, but the idea that activism in ethnic studies has been rooted in the fight to institutionalize higher education, with the stories and the histories about the most marginalized groups that had been left out of history, and particularly to challenge traditional disciplines like history, anthropology, and so on, that have othered and created this line of difference based on race, gender, class, and so on that marginalize these groups in the production of knowledge in the university. And so we need to come back to this idea of what does ethnic studies mean today? How does it matter? And how is this connected to the Northridge protests? So for one, when we are largely in our classrooms, students love this idea that they can learn about who they are, how they're connected to themselves, to each other, and the world. Two, we still need to talk about issues of diversity and ethnic relations based on the idea that it's not just about tolerance, treating it very superficial, celebration, and so on. There's deep issues, as the first presenter talked about, this Trump effect, that they're really having a huge impact on students, universities, education, and so on. So this is still very important to this conversation. Other things that are still going on, the ban of ethnic studies in Arizona. If you didn't know about this is not that long ago. Budget cuts with San Francisco State, the College of Ethnic Studies, the founding College of Ethnic Studies being threatened with budget cuts just a few years ago. And then the CSU Task Force on Ethnic Studies that did a survey of the sort of what is the field of ethnic studies now in the CSU and what needs to be done. So there's a lot of things happening that still make ethnic studies very relevant. And two, the next one, K through 12, the ABA 2772 is going to be in effect 2020, so we need to start having this conversation to institutionalize ethnic studies in K through 12. So my point is, with all these things happening on the ground and being very relevant, it is central to this idea of education. Okay? So I'm going to share a quick anecdote, and then I will give you a more critical context of the Northridge with my story. So that in the introduction, I was said to have been the president, vice chair of the President's Commission on Diversity and Inclusion at Stanislaus, and also director of ethnic studies. And I came to a point where those things was in conflict last spring, in which the idea of diversity and inclusion is great, but also how critical is that when you address things about taking away the issue of multiculturalism and racial equity in your curriculum. So I had to use my students and give them a teaching moment to empower them to first understand what was going on with the GE changes that impacted our school and our program, because largely 70% of our courses in our program were directly under that multicultural requirement. So taking that away, that directly impacted our program and our courses, enrollment and so on. And things were being made, decisions were being made without very little student voice representation, as well as faculty of color. And so being on the forefront of that, I used my students to attend these meetings. They didn't know that they had the voice or the will to go to a Senate meeting to share their stories and speak to faculty. And this is important because the faculty at Stanislaus State is 80% white, but the student population is not. It's about 70 to 80% students of color. So the difference and the distinction, as someone said earlier, this is important because then when they make decisions that impact students and their curriculum and what they get in their classrooms without much input, this is the reason why they need to be in the forefront. So my point is, in the spring semester of last year, we went to every Senate meeting, took my class, and they had to show up and they made testimonies and talked to the white faculty who had voting rights about what to do with the GE requirement of multiculturalism. And at the end of the day, after a long fight with them, they eventually voted our way. So yay, success. But it was, yes. But that meant that my students needed to learn what civic engagement meant, what being socially personally responsible meant, and that they needed to have a voice on campus when things were being made for them that impacted them without them knowing. So that's an example of what we did, and it's connected to the CSU Northridge story because they have a similar situation, but the problem is they have 2 requirements in GE instead of 1, like most CSUs for multiculturalism. So that is the issue with what's going on with Northridge, and why this impacts them is because taking that second one away will drastically impact the majority of programs in departments like gender studies, ethnic studies that provide those courses. And so this is where this conversation is coming from. Okay, while he does that, I will contextualize this for you in a more critical perspective. So based on this topic of decolonized education, what does this mean? Education in K through 12 and the university is highly racialized gender and political spaces, traditionally privileging the histories and experiences of Europeans at the expense of silencing the histories and experiences of racialized indigenous groups. The stakes or costs of education for the most marginalized. It reflects this concept of knowledge production, which basically allows the master narrative, or those that have their stories get told, and by whom, particularly of Europeans, over the expense of those that have been silenced and marginalized in history. So for instance, I wanted to address this issue. It's really interesting. We see the contradictions of Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day this week, correct? And for LA and most recently San Francisco honored this day. So that's great, instead of Columbus Day. Yes. But the contradiction lies at the fact that we celebrate the master narrative of European colonialism in the guise of discovering America, a contrast to the recognition of the grassroots movement and resistance of indigenous people of that very same claim, right? Thus, education is a highly contested site about who gets to produce knowledge and what kinds of knowledge get produced. So in that sense, centering ethnic studies and the voices of marginalized groups, we can understand why students engage in activism in the spaces of the university or higher education to contest these highly racialized, gender, and imperial ways that knowledge is produced and disseminated. So if we look at the contemporary struggles of the CSU protests, it must be understood in relation to our history of struggle and activism. It's not far removed from the past. The establishment of our very own ethnic studies department on campus today and various programs and departments throughout the country reflect the student activism of the Third World Liberation Front. We're still fighting for existence and place in education, for the right to tell and share our histories and experiences. So I want to leave you with this quote from a colleague of mine. She teaches at Northwestern University in Chicago, and they recently got a faculty line based on the student activism that led to that. So they always have to fight for things. And she says that instead of maybe thinking about ethnic studies and different groups and teaching the stories of different groups, let's connect them. And she's advocating for this idea of a racial studies project. So she says, the study of a single racial or ethnic group must connect broader historical and global systems of race and racism that work relationally and under power structures such as white supremacy and capitalism. So hopefully we leave with this thinking that decolonizing education in the university is this sense of who belongs there, who gets to have a voice, and what kind of knowledge are we producing. Thank you.
Thanks again to Dr. Baulo for that very insightful presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Andrea Moore. Dr. Andrea Moore is an assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Department. She received her BA in Sociology and PhD in Cultural Studies from the University of California, Davis. Her academic brand focuses on ethnic history and sociocultural production. Her areas of expertise are situated within Pan-African history, cultural studies, sociology, and popular culture. Dr. Moore has over 10 years of teaching experience in higher education, working with the Department for Behavioral Social Sciences at Sacramento City College and the African American and African Studies Department at UC Davis. Please help me welcome Dr. Andrea Moore.
Good afternoon. All right, I just want to start off by thanking the people who put this event on, Chris J., Elvia, and all the participants. I want to thank my class for actually showing up today. Yay. But also I want to acknowledge the ancestors in the room. I want to acknowledge the ancestors on the wall and give thanks and appreciation, because when we talk about decolonizing the classroom or decolonizing these institutions, we have to pay honor to all of those who fought and died to do just that, so that we can even be in spaces like this, right? All right, so let's move on. I want to talk to you about how I decolonized my classroom. And as Professor Ramirez stated, I began working here, just 3 years ago as a tenure track, part-time since 2011. And when I came to Sacramento State, I decided to make this my home opposed to UC Davis or even Los Rios Community College, because I worked in all three simultaneously, and I was trying to figure out where did I want to be, like you, Nancy. And I chose Sac State specifically because of the students, specifically because of the population of students who come through these particular areas and through these walls, because I feel like I wanted to serve that community and those communities. And in doing that, I needed to be reflective of how I approached the disciplines that I teach in. And I needed to go back and modify the way I was teaching classes, and I wanted to create a space where I was addressing what I feel like the social climate is addressing or dismissing. And part of the ways that I did that will be discussed today. So thank you. And so these are a couple of signs. Number one, in this house, there's certain affirmations, right? We believe Black Lives Matter. Women's rights are human rights. No human is illegal. Science is real. Love is love. Kindness is everything. And so this might be like hippy-dippy, corny love. But in real life, right? I say that often. But in real life, these are the areas where we see a lot of contention, and a lot of dismissal, and a lot of minimizing, and a lot of violence. And so I think it's important that, the people who enter my space know that this is what I stand for. So Last year around this time, I actually posted this on Twitter, this other picture here that says this is a positive space. No homophobia, no transphobia, no biphobia, no femphobia, no fatphobia, no xenophobia, no ableism, no classism, no racism, no disrespect, no shaming. You will be asked to leave, right, if you do these things. And I wrote, my classroom, hashtag my classroom, hashtag feminist hornets at WRC Sac State, because they put this image up in the Women's Resource Center. Immediately I was trolled by someone who said, yeah, this is the ish, we got to get out of here. And the symbolism and the representation of whoever trolled me obviously does not align with any of these types of thinking, but I was happy. So it's like, yay, this is the people, right? This is also the community that I want to reach. And so in me thinking about how to decolonize the classroom, I wanted to first empower the people who felt marginalized and empower the histories that have been marginalized. But at the same time, wanting people to feel connected in community too, right? So that uncomfortability that you have to feel, we have to sit in it, even myself. So this is a different clicker than the one Jose had, so I'll just move on. All right, so in thinking about decolonization, decolonizing the classroom or decolonizing the institution or our syllabus, I looked up some research by Celeste Hayes, who actually back in 2006, who was a SIT graduate, wrote exactly about how to do this. And a couple of her quotes resonated with me, and I want to read some of them. I remained mindful of my student experience as I was now given the freedom to create a learning culture of my own. I felt the pressure to ensure that this environment promoted an engaging learning experience. That resonated with me for a couple of reasons, because I not too long ago was a graduate student at UC Davis. So I remember what it's like to be a student. And I remember what it's like to want to learn, want to feel visible in the classroom, and want to speak up or challenge what you're reading. And I also wanted to keep that in mind anytime I make an assignment or anytime I create a conversation. In trying to create a space like that, it does feel like a little bit of pressure, because you don't want the student who doesn't necessarily fit into any of the things that I've mentioned previously to feel isolated, to feel threatened, to feel uncomfortable necessarily. You want them to be able to still engage even if they don't necessarily agree. And so you have to talk through a lot of the information. And so I have freedom. You know, freedom is the larger piece here, but there's still a question mark. Because freedom, ideally, yes, I have the freedom to do that, but in theory, what happens if a student complains, right? In theory, what happens if the department doesn't support what you have to say? In theory, what really does freedom look like if you work for an institution that has particular guidelines and structures and so on and so forth? So I question that a lot, right? And I'm constantly trying to open up my chest and remind myself that I am free. The fact that I have to have this conversation as a professor who has a doctorate degree and still has to say, wait a minute, you are free. You're not enslaved. You have a free mind. That's something I still have to tell myself, in addition to making sure my students know they have a right to exercise their agency, even if they don't agree with me. The next quote, I find that social justice as a Black person, which is one of my most salient of identities, is a means of a people's absolute survival. And that's almost a shame. That as a person, I have to operate in spaces where I'm constantly advocating for myself and other people and other social injustice just to feel like I can live. That's survival. That's not thriving. That's taking me back to growing up in the Bay Area, taking me back to living in certain spaces where each day you're just trying to make it to the next, you're trying to get home safe, right? Each day you're trying to make it to the next day. So we're still in a space of trying to survive and not thrive, right? Especially with our social climate. And then this last, the social constructs that narrate our identities impact the ways in which we perceive the world and the ways in which the world perceives us. So perception, some believe, is reality, right? But again, I often talk about who has the power to define. And as a cultural studies theorist, I believe that it is the members' meanings that actually should be honored first, not the outsiders who are analyzing and critiquing it, but how do the people who create the culture actually talk about their culture and define their culture. So placing that power back into the people who create the culture, removing it from the critics' hands. And while criticism and analytical thought and critical thinking is important, we still first must acknowledge the people's meaning first. And I think that's extremely important. So in my classroom, one of the classes I teach is the Ethnic Studies 11 course, Ethnic Studies 100 course, and I have to first eradicate the master narrative. And I like to do that with people who don't necessarily look like me, because for some reason people listen to people who don't look like me, right? And so I do that, I try and do that with multiple voices. And some of the ways that I do that in these classroom spaces is I use Ronald Takaki's A Different Mirror, A History of a Multicultural America, who brings up the master narrative, as we've already discussed. Again, in case you do not know, the master narrative is usually just America's history, how America's history is taught, and even just the language within itself, America's history. We have to break that down. Is it his story? Is it her story? When it should be our story. And so Takaki points this out very early, that when you look at the construction of America, oftentimes people mistake it for being essentially a white country because European settlers came here and then they created the infrastructure of what became the United States. However, we know that people occupied North American territories, South and Central American territories, so many other places. There's pre-colonized history. So why is it that we begin education from the colonizer's POV? Let's talk about it. Let's break that down. Let's deconstruct what is it. And so Takaki argues that this narrative reflects a narrow definition of who an American is and reinforces a general thinking which can be found in curriculum, news and entertainment, media, business practices, and public spaces. And so then I have my students give me an example of each. How does this continue to show up in our media practices? How does this show up in our curriculum? How does this show up at this institution? And so on and so forth. And then I also like to use Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Both of them take the approach that since its inception, the construction of the United States of America has always been multicultural, and it should be inclusive of all the people's voices who were here during its construction. And so I let my students know that's the foundational concept of the class. From here on, you need to think about everything from that lens. I also like to start with a Twitter feed from the Zen Project, which is all about teaching a people's history. Every day they have something that's reflective of history and connecting it with current times. There's teaching materials, free teaching materials, tons and tons and tons of information. And so Zen, I have a quote here from him also. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country presented as the history of a family conceals the fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, often repressed between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and class. And in such as world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners. So when we are studying these stories, they're oftentimes between these two binaries, right? But so for me, going into Audre Lorde, we need to F with the grays. We need to look for the gray areas. We need to see what's not leaning all the way over here or what's not leaning all the way over here, because we're missing something. And so I like to explore those areas and then kind of engage in a Socratic method and hear what the students have to say. And I also like to, lead in after talking about the master narrative with talking about indigenous people. What does that mean? How do we define that? So we need to break down this master narrative and deconstruct it in relation to the indigenous people of the United States. And so I look at what the dictionary says and we break this down, right? Who did it originally include, right? And so this is a definition that sometimes you will see in certain dictionaries. If you just Googled it, you can find this. And so when you start to think about indigenous people, it acknowledges all the people who have been marginalized in American history. Also, Takaki references Toni Morrison's concept of race, where it becomes a metaphor to the understanding the construction of Americanness is also understanding the construction of whiteness. And using race as that metaphor where you see white male and everyone else is the other constantly shows up. Constantly shows up. So we talk about the ethnic studies aisle in the grocery store, for example. And like, why is it called the ethnic studies aisle? And now how the names have changed to just call it like the Asian food or Hispanic food. But what's on the rest of the aisles? And why is it separated? Why is it secluded? Why is minority referencing women and people of color? Why do you think that if you're going to take an ethnic studies class, you're not going to talk about white ethnicity? Everybody has an ethnic identity, whether they know it or not. So I like to bring all of this up and how somehow minority is devoid of whiteness, or ethnicity is devoid of whiteness. And even, help the white students in the class think back to their ethnic identity and their history and how it's taught or not taught. And so this master narrative is so important when we start to look at the legalization of Americanness. And in this current time with immigration policies like the public charge, the family support, where we're going to have a lot of families, people of color, legal, people who we use these terms legal, right? People who are citizens and people who are here for different reasons trying to become naturalized, and how they're going to be short-stopped if they don't make a certain amount of money. We talk about where did the history of immigration policies begin. 1790 Naturalization Act. It told you, or defined legally, who could and who could not become naturalized. It also lets us understand that if we're using the structures that were created to govern this country, how they were not evenly distributed. Because if this is true, if being born here automatically qualified you as a citizen, how come all the native folks who were living here weren't automatically given citizenship? And what would the United States have looked like if the law was actually evenly applied? So we kind of break this down, and we keep connecting the 1790 Naturalization Act with current immigration policy, and shows that if you actually study immigration policy, it gives you the clue of why the ethnic landscape of the United States looks the way it looks, why we open our borders, when we open our borders, why we close our borders, and when we close our borders, and to whom. So we look at that from a legal spectrum. And then I also like to bring in Patricia Hill Collins, The Matrix of Domination. I studied sociology for a while. I teach oftentimes sociology at Los Rios in the community college. And when I studied this many, many, many years ago, this was my first introduction to intersectionality, if you will. And one of the things that I needed to do a better job at this institution was teaching from an intersectional approach. And so what that meant is that I was noticing that I had male dominance show up in my scholarship. I needed to bring in more women writers. I needed to bring in more diverse groups of people. And so Patricia Hill Collins points out the role that people who are considered minorities have in society, and how they constantly are operating from this matrix of oppression and trying to fight against it. Then we move into intersectionality with Kimberly Crenshaw coining this term in 1989. She did a famous TED Talk where she was urging people to pay attention to intersectionality as it relates to even like the Black Lives Matter movement, and how there are many women who were being murdered also. But we need to say their names, say her name. It's not just men, it's also women. And so we need to focus and bring in more people. And so paying attention to all of these intersectional identities actually brings us together instead of separating us and dividing us. Paying attention to like our ableist language is so important, that we begin to reprogram our minds and retrain ourselves in how we speak. Microaggressions were already talked about. Kimberly Crenshaw also pointed this out. And so microaggressions, we mentioned before about race, but there's gender microaggressions. If you take that matrix of domination, there's microaggressions for every single one of those areas. And we have to check ourselves and say, hey, where am I actually still fostering some form of oppression against a group? Even in my own position of being oppressed, where am I privileged? And so one of the bigger pieces that I kind of want to end with is anti-Blackness is so real. And as a black professor, I experience it in many, many different ways. And one way that I want to push back against anti-blackness is to validate black identity and black culture in the classroom. Again, this picture that you're seeing here is an example of a young male who lived in Toronto who actually sued this restaurant for how he was treated in the restaurant, and he actually won. And there was tons of backlash from people who did not think that he was not worthy, simply because he was a black male. And so when we start to think about anti-blackness, it goes into a particular kind of racism, primarily targeted towards the material, social, and political exclusion of phenotypically black persons. And it operates on a multinational scale. It is not just here in the US. And so how do I attack that? I attack it in the type of classes that I have created. Black images in popular culture. We don't just look at black caricatures and say we are stereotypes. I have them look at the stereotypes, and then I really teach them about the process of hegemony and how it's through this process of hegemony in which your mind is being shaped to understand what's good, what's wrong, what's beautiful, what's ugly, and how the people who have been in positions of power in institutions, they keep creating the same will and reaffirming their position here, and everybody else is down. But I flip that on its head, and I value what has been devalued. So, for example, we look at like a Cardi B and say, what else can we see besides just the stereotype? We try and pull away just this conservative hegemonic lens. I also teach a class called Protest in Hip Hop, which is a service learning course that provides students the opportunity to engage in activism. This course was originally taught to be paired with the Black Lives Matter movement from Sacramento, where I have my students who actually participate with Black Lives Matter Sacramento, learning about activism, learning what it's like to be a part of a grassroots organization. And so my charge to action is that we have to have community accountability. And Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Baj actually talk about intersectionality, and I'm just going to read this quote and I'm almost done. Finally, intersectionality as a form of critical inquiry and praxis can help raise community accountability as a normative principle so that the interlocking nature of oppression faced by groups is not lost in racial justice or gender or sexual justice initiatives. Community accountability is also a significant guideline for non-oppressive research practices that intersectionality scholars need to engage. And so this is how I show up, even just through an email. And I have to be very aware of the fact that somebody can see me show up like this in email and automatically think, okay, we know who she is, and be completely turned off by that, right? And can respond in a different way, but I have to take a stance. And this is how I choose to decolonize my classroom and myself as a professor on this campus. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore, for that powerful analysis. And our next speaker is Dr. Susan Nakaoka. Dr. Susan Nakaoka recently joined the Division of Social Work in spring of 2018 after her tenure as an assistant professor with the Myron B. Thompson School of Social Work at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She received her PhD in urban planning from UCLA and has over 12 years of direct service experience and program development for low-income housing residents across the country. Her research includes a photo voice project with residents of Little Tokyo in Los Angeles, a qualitative study of the effectiveness of a critical race theory curriculum on public child welfare workers, and case studies of Asian American community development corporations and a Native Hawaiian social enterprise. Dr. Nakaoka will be teaching courses in the division related to cross-cultural theory and practice, social theory, social policy, and research methods. So everyone, please help me welcome Dr. Susan Nakaoka.
Thank you very much. So this presentation is, I'm just going to time myself, is something that we're working on for my colleagues from the University of Hawaii, where I used to work. I wasn't supposed to say what my project's based on because there's some critical things I'm going to talk about, but that's okay. You all won't tell, right, that we talked about. But anyway, my co-authors, just to say that I'm not speaking from an indigenous perspective myself, right? So I'm Japanese American from, actually from the East LA area. But my research and scholarship is really based on race, critical race theory. Both of my parents were born in the Japanese American concentration camps during World War II. So my perspective is that kind of critical perspective based on social justice. And interestingly, Mari Ono, who's actually a graduate of Sacramento State, and Sherry Taratani, who's the other two Japanese Americans on the faculty there, are from California as well. So being Japanese American in Hawaii is very interesting, because if you come from this background of having lived as a person of color, your family talks about being incarcerated, you go to Hawaii, they weren't incarcerated in Hawaii, even though it's 1/3 Japanese American. The governor's Japanese American, people in power are Japanese Americans, so there's a very different racial order. But the fact that in our Indigenous Affairs Committee, the Japanese Americans on the committee are from California was very telling, that we do kind of connect with that experience of being communities of color. And then we had Dr. Jingguo, who's from China, and Lana Kaupua, who was our only Native Hawaiian tenure track professor, and she just recently retired. So that's what I'm gonna talk about, is this process of we have a very active and stated decolonization, or what we call indigenization process at the University of Hawaii. And there's a difference, and I'll talk about why we use that word. In social work in particular, it's important because, as you can imagine, social workers are the people working with communities who need, who have particular who have particular social problems. And in social work, we had a big, hard time with, I shouldn't say those words together. We had a hard time with dealing with diversity, right? So at first it was cultural awareness, then it was diversity, then it was multiculturalism, then it was cultural competence, as if you could learn a few things about each community and then you're competent. So we really wanted to move that. Now we talk about cultural humility, contextual competence, other things, but in our school there was a push to indigenize and decolonize. The problem with literature on a lot of those things that I just mentioned in social work, they're written from the perspective of a white researcher, a white social worker working with communities of color. So it also didn't apply to us as scholars of color, to our students as practitioners of color. So that's another reason why we kind of are embarking on investigating how we do this. So in addition to recognizing the indigenous people and land that we're on here at Sac State, I did want to recognize my kind of the ancestral knowledge here. And these are two professors at University of Hawaii. Again, both recently retired, but we're actively involved in indigenizing the school. So this is at first it was a secret, but this is a medium-sized public university. It is the largest university, though, in the state. So the social workers, you can imagine if you're a low-income student, you're a working-class student, if you want to be a social worker, if you want to have an MSW, you're going to go to this school, right? There wasn't another school, accredited school of social work until the 2000s, and this school has been in existence for 83 years. But the university recently took on an institutionalized system of creating a Hawaiian place of learning, or indigenizing the entire campus, and in turn we did the same to our school. So I want you all to shout out when you think of Hawaii, and here's a picture here of on Oahu, and another picture. What word comes to your mind right away? Beaches. Paradise. Yeah. When I said I was moving to Hawaii, paradise was the word that came up the most often, right? People kind of contextualize Hawaii as paradise. But actually, because of the history of colonization of Hawaii, there's extreme health disparities for indigenous people there. So Native Hawaiians, and actually people from other Pacific islands, so Tongans, Samoans, people from Micronesia. And they're most represented in the homelessness or houselessness rate. Hawaii has the highest homelessness rate in the country. It's usually either Hawaii or Washington, D.C. when you're comparing per capita rates. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are disproportionately incarcerated. And Micronesians, who are represented in the homeless population, low-wage labor. If you don't know the history of Micronesia, the U.S. bombed the islands of Micronesia in the 1940s and 50s just to do bombing practice. So their agriculture, their environment was ruined. They have health issues to this day, including cancer, other things. So the U.S. gave them what's called a compact of free association. They could come to the U.S. more freely. They're considered non-immigrants. So in one sense, they have more freedom to come. On the other sense, they don't qualify for a lot of services because they're in this weird classification. And as a result, they do come to Hawaii because it's closest. The culture is most similar, but they're highly represented in the homeless population. And this particular encampment, I participated in a research project there. It's now been fenced off so that people can't put tents up. So it's kind of another slap in the face that you have, this is Native Hawaiian land, and they can't even, can't afford to live there, right? Housing is really expensive. And then they're fenced off so they can't even erect tents. So we kind of looked at how we go about, we wanted to have a critical perspective of how we indigenize the school. This is something that faculty talked about for over 10 years, probably 12 years. And it just, even though we have the language down, it just doesn't, we wanted to know how does it look in practice? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? Oh, I should have mentioned the title. So that's how, one of the issues of Hawaiian knowledge or Hawaiian ways of knowing is using metaphor. So our title, I'll try to say it right, He'ala Kukui Lima Kanaka, means a steep pathway where group effort is necessary to climb safely to the top. And we came upon that metaphor after much discussion, much consultation with elders. We didn't want a linear pathway because we knew it wasn't linear. We knew it was complex. We knew it was messy. So we came kind of this steep pathway. Sometimes we fall off. Sometimes people get cut. But we need group effort to keep moving forward right to the top, which we probably won't ever really attain. So I won't talk about the literature behind kind of our critical look at our process, but there's some literature on the critical indigenous pedagogy of place that really emphasizes connection of place, or aina, with people and looking at things, looking at concepts critically in relation to family, community, and land. We really also wanted to utilize a newer theory or adaptation of critical race theory called Kanaka Crit or Kanaka Oiwi Crit that's really an adaptation for Native Hawaiian people and indigenous people. And they have about six or eight tenets, but these are the three we focused on in our analysis, which was the consequences of colonialism and occupation, aloha aina, or love and care for the land and nation, or kuleana, having a right or responsibility, the authority. And that's kind of how we saw our school, the faculty and students. So we wanted to, again, look at this really concerted effort to become a Hawaiian place of learning, to look at indigenization. And we finally, after years of debate, came up with some real specific language, so I won't go over this. I'd rather read you some of our other things, but really an initiative to create a more concerted effort that's prioritizing Native Hawaiian values. Should have come back here. So if you don't know a lot about the history of Hawaii, it was illegally overthrown. So let me just quickly say why we use indigenization instead of decolonization. Because some people feel they were never colonized, right? They're currently illegally occupied, and they were illegally overthrown. President Clinton apologized for the legal overthrow. There has yet to be reparations. There has yet to be land given back. It's just in a constant state of illegal occupation. So to say decolonizing, some people feel that that doesn't recognize that they were never formally colonized. They're really illegally occupied. So that's why we use indigenization. So we use this method of collecting mo'olelos, or which is a shared narrative, stories. It's similar to testimonial. It's similar to kind of creating a narrative, and we kind of were in conversation with each other about what we thought of this process of indigenization. We definitely felt like there was mistakes along the way, that the school was not quite there. So one of our stories, if you will, was about a faculty search. We did, as I mentioned, we only had one Native Hawaiian scholar left, so our faculty searches are super important. So our Indigenous Affairs Committee, which I was chairing, again, kind of problematic that I'm not Indigenous, but there was no one else on the committee to do so. We were able to meet with each of our faculty candidates. after we met with them, our committee kind of created a report, submitted the report, and then we found out that it wasn't going to be forwarded to the dean for consideration. They said there was no process to do that. There was faculty debates, like knockdown, crying, upset debates, threatening emails about how they could not include our, in essence, if they included our committee's report, the members of the committee would get 2 ways of influencing the faculty search, and that's not fair. So although it was not resolved in that search nor the next search, we had a series of meetings and it was finally resolved that committees could support it. But the questions against us submitting that report were, I have some quotes here from other faculty. Well, it's kind of in essence what I said. They were saying, how can you have 2? You've already submitted your individual comments. You can't have 2. We don't do that for other committees. We have an international committee. They didn't submit a report. And the international committee was like, we don't mind. It's okay if you look at their report. But there was that kind of really heavy debate. The members of the committee felt like, quote, it was as if they were providing us with an opportunity to meet with each candidate in order to provide us with a voice in the decision. Then they silenced that voice. So something we felt really strongly about, being silenced. And again, after several meetings that became really emotional, the faculty finally agreed. The second example I want to bring of kind of this attempt to indigenize that kind of fell down in some places, or we got some of those cuts on the mountain, were instituting cultural protocols. So cultural protocols can be from, giving a lei to a guest speaker, having food in an event, right? And that's something also not supported by the institution. Faculty pay for themselves, and especially if you're acknowledging that Native Hawaiians are always called on to come in to speak, they're not compensated, right? We expect to do them at volunteers. So if you're someone like us, you'd pay out of your pocket for a really nice lei or a little stipend that you would give in a card and a gift, right? So that's all kind of ways of incorporating cultural protocols that weren't supported by the institution. But this is the one that became really contentious. So doing a chant or a Hawaiian prayer at the beginning of an event is something that's culturally recognized. It was always kind of left to the last minute, who's going to do the chant. So the students themselves, 2 Native Hawaiian students, created a chant for us. So as you hear it, think about it. I'm going to play it. It's very short. Think about how you would feel if you were asked to sing along or to do this chant before events. Just think about how you would feel.
Ke velina maine ke kini hali ia e ke kahaukani pai ka uatua hine Ea hoi ke a nue nani a ka halo o puna. He mai, ua o mai la ka hale aloha. Aloha e, aloha e, aloha e.
So beautiful, right? It's really a nice way to start events. It's a welcoming, it's an acknowledging that you're being brought into the school. Students, alumni wrote it. So our Indigenous Affairs committees wanted to do this at our graduation events, our other events. We had rehearsals, we had this recording for faculty to practice, we had talked about it in staff meetings, and again, it became this knockdown, drag-out conversations about, I don't feel comfortable doing it, I'm not Hawaiian, I don't know that this is appropriate, even though Native Hawaiian students and Auntie Lynette, who was the practitioner in the beginning, are the ones who are encouraging that we incorporate this into the school. So it became this real debate over whether it's appropriate, but really for us, the way that we saw it was an excuse to push away, really institutionalizing Native Hawaiian protocols and becoming comfortable with it, right? Pushing each other to become comfortable with doing things like an oli or a chant. And then we also did faculty training and huakai to really get, faculty would say they can't incorporate this in the curriculum. Their students know more than me. Oops, I'll be real quick. people were saying they can't incorporate Native Hawaiian content in their classes because they weren't Hawaiian. Their students know more. It's not my area of expertise. I'm not indigenous, so I can't do it. So we kind of did these field trips, right, where we went out, we invited faculty to learn about the land, to figure out in Waikiki you belong to a particular, what's called ahupua'a, knowing the history, knowing the connection to land. And the first one was really well attended. And then the second one was a little less attended. And then by the third one, only the committee was attending. So even though there was interest, on paper we're a Hawaiian place of learning, there still wasn't that commitment from other faculty to really incorporate it. So we really, in the end, feel that we really need to acknowledge the complexity of fitting indigenous protocols and values into a Western institution, but then actually work through it, right? Just don't stop there and say it's too hard, to really push each other to do it. To understand the distinction between form, which is learning the technical knowledge, and essence, so the embodiment of values, which is also one of those ancestral gifts from Auntie Lynette in the beginning. And then that co-learning is important, that if you do feel that students do have this knowledge, then learn from them, embrace them, give them that power in the classroom to help you and to help the other students without relying on them. And then also that we really value that lens of Kanaka Crit, or Kanaka critical race theory, that schools of social work in particular are primed for this because they do have values around social justice and working in culturally relevant ways. And then if we kind of solidify and keep working on this best practice, hopefully other places will follow. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Susan Nakaoka, for that amazing presentation. So now we have time for some questions and answers. If folks in the audience have any questions, comments, feedback for our presenters, please, we welcome your contributions. We have a microphone for folks. Any hands?
Hello.
Yes.
So you mentioned cultural practices in academia or in the institution. I think that's a conversation that Sac State has been having of like how could we do like cultural practices of land acknowledgement because we're on occupied land. So just wondering like how is it at like a student level, how do you think that students could like push to have faculty and to have staff and administrators to like push for something like that? Because I guess I had never heard of it as a cultural practice, and when you said it, it really spoke to me, and I just wanted to thank you because that just kind of makes my head start, okay, we could really do this. We could really push to have some sort of cultural practices, especially at like graduations, at events and all these different things. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for doing that here at Sac State. Definitely the louder the student's voice, the more effective it was for faculty in pushing them to incorporate. So when I was there, we made sure that there was a student representative on our committee and a community representative. That was also meant by pushback, by the way, because people didn't want them to have a vote on their tenure. I don't know how that counted towards their tenure if we had people on our committee that were from the community or students. But having that voice is really important. So the more you can organize, the better. And after my son actually just graduated from UC Riverside, where he passed the resolution to recognize Native land at graduation, and if all official UC ceremonies now have to read that statement. So he was one of the school senators. Oh, thank you. I'm very proud of him. So he was a student senator to make that happen. So we can talk after.
Any other questions, comments from the audience? Yes. Dr. Saravia?
Can you hear? I have a question, I guess, for all the panelists. I will be interested if you have any one tip that you do, because I feel like you were talking about health disparities and the effects of being in these kinds of institutions, but also then Nancy talked about resistance and what these questions bring about, and then in the classroom with those challenges, and then activism, and then again institutionally. So is there any one tip that you can share with us about the way that we can then nurture our souls and resist in these institutions that very often is not friendly to people who look like us.
Can you hear? Okay, can you hear? Okay, great. So I have to admit that I spent a whole semester with my students going to faculty meetings and Senate meetings. It was taxing on my health, my mental, physical, emotional health. And that's something faculty of color have to do, the extra thing that other faculty don't have to do, right? Especially being a woman of color. So after that semester, I was just done too. But it gave my students a sense of belonging and community on campus voice. And I hope they continue that. But I felt very alone during that process. There was no, kit for me to take care of myself, because it was either do it or not. And a lot of times we live under that constraint, right? I mean, I love that there's studies out there, but there isn't a resource, a support, institutionalized for faculty of color, and that is the problem, right? So we always have to fight, and I don't have the answer, but that's it.
So no tip, Val? No tip, Val? My tip would be that, one, you have to have knowledge of self as a teacher, right? So there is a responsibility that you have as a teacher. And so for me, what I've been doing is going back to instilling practices in my own life, my personal life, and thinking about what are some of the practices that my ancestors took part in that have now possibly been lost on some of these recent generations, and kind of going back and studying those and implementing them back in my life on a daily basis as a form of healing mind, body, and soul, and relief. So it also connects me to them, but it also energizes me in remembering everything that they went through so that I could be here. So that's my tip.
Hi, everyone. So my tip, I think I also don't have a direct answer, but I know I started with Gloria Ansaldúa, and so I want to end perhaps on that note. She has a concept called entering the serpent, so being in constant reflection about those binaries that sometimes we get pulled back into, not necessarily because we want to, but because, again, the very structures and systems that we're part of are very are things we've inherited, right? So things that are very much part of our matrix of domination. So I think being in constant reflection, entering that serpent, and being very aware of our shadow beast, that's what Gloria Ansaldúa calls it, of and really looking the shadow beast in the face and saying, forget you, I'm gonna get you. And this is how I'm gonna recontextualize the way that you're living, breathing spaces within the institutions, and and then of course having fun. So make sure that you're having fun. So that's why I appreciate all of my colegas and the students, because they really help me, stay out of that space. When I am in the serpent for too long, I need to be brought back out. So so to continue, that process of reflection too. So have fun.
I was recently talking with some McNair scholars at LMU, and one of the tips I shared with them was to find your people and to nurture your clica or your group, your community. I think in places like this, relationships are so vital and important. I'm really grateful for Nancy connecting me with folks like Elvia and all of you. That's been really important, I think, finding my people and whoever those people are, right, nurturing that community, because even in spaces like this, we still exist and thrive.
Any other comments, questions?
So the first question was about sort of personal care, and I took notes. The second question, I guess, I want to hear from all the panelists about what changes do we need to make at the institutional level. I mean, the first thing that what are the things that we should start working on? Because the first thing that I thought is like the institutional support for faculty of color, right? So what does that look like? So can each one of you make a suggestion about institutionally what kind of changes need to do? We can start.
I think my list is too long. Yeah, having been at 4 years at Stanislaus, and I was came in as doing administrative work. I was actually the program director as a junior faculty, so that added a lot of work. So, and as a faculty of color, woman of color, it's very taxing. And then being asked to serve on committees because you're the only voice of diversity. So, yes. And then the work you have to show for it is your folder that says that this is how you prove your tenure. So, and unfortunately, the university has a very traditional way of evaluating faculty. And if there is another way, that would be great. Why don't we move beyond the decolonial mind, right? The traditional way of evaluation doesn't work for faculty of color because we were never built to be part of the institution. So that's where we need to start. The basics. And I forgot to say earlier that the success of our work with the students last semester was that they're now forming a committee, an ad hoc committee of faculty and students to make it a university requirement. Whether it's multiculturalism, race, ethnicity, kind of like the one you have here, Stanislaus doesn't have, and not all CSUs have. So at least we're moving in that direction since the efforts that we made. So at least that's success. But again, I think it's a huge question. I have too long of a list.
Okay, my answer, just to be quiet real quick, is to hold the institution accountable for what it claims that it does. So if you go to the President's office website, the Office of the President's website, you can see Sac State's mission, Sac State's vision, and Sac State's values. And the mission, as California's capital university, we transform lives by preparing students for leadership, service, and success. So we need to hold them accountable for doing that. They claim to do that. We claim to do that. They must show us how they're doing that, and they must continue to do that. Vision: Sacramento State will be a recognized leader in education, innovation, and engagement. Again, if there's areas that we feel like that is not true, we have to bring it to the forefront of the people who are the holders of the vote and say, hey, you claim to do this. We need to hold you accountable. Show us how you're doing it. And again, the values: student success. So you are the center of the value. If you don't feel like you can be successful based on certain structures, bring it to their attention. Scholarship, research and creative activity, diversity and inclusion, community engagement, innovation, integrity, and accountability. These are the values that your institution claims that it upholds. And so if they're not in any space, it is your job to bring it to them and say, hey, this is what you said you stand for, but it's not actually happening in real life. So you can't just talk it, you got to walk it, right?
Yes. I think along those lines, like funding institutions like the Center for Race and Immigration Studies and Social Justice, right? So having the funding and structures in place when we're doing the work is important, and then removing those artificial barriers. So like the example about the faculty search where people were saying, oh, that's not fair because we've never done that before. That was unnecessary. Or putting on the job description, you have to graduate from an accredited, CSW accredited program, which means you had to be educated in the US. So that immediately cut out people from New Zealand who are Maori, who had an interest in indigenous populations, and then they couldn't apply for faculty positions because someone decided to put that in the job description. And when we brought it up, the person said, oh, I think it's too late to take that out. And then she never followed up, she never did anything, and no one held her accountable. So just calling your colleagues when those artificial barriers get put up also.
I think I also have a very long list, but I'm going to speak more so in the K through 12 section. Right now, the work that I do in Stockton, it's So I'm the director of a education equity policy organization. And so our goal is to train families in ed equity policy. But I feel like that, I mean, I don't want to say policy is the answer because it's not the only answer. But being in spaces in K through 12 is so important, especially for places like Stockton. I mean, just looking at our statistics around reading, right? We have 24% of our student population in Stockton is reading, either meeting or going beyond the standard in our state test. And then when we look at the type of curriculum that's being taught, the teachers who are in the space in Stockton, the communities who have the power to create knowledge in Stockton, we realize there, you know, like just how everybody's been presenting in their research, that we actually are very few in numbers, and so we need to diverse. So I guess there's two things: being more present in K through 12, and then diversifying our universities so that it does speak to the number of students of color within our universities. So if there's anything to do, I'd say maybe policy and community work and university research coming together. So yeah. And then have fun. Just kidding. I just don't want to leave on a sad note.
I think, I mean, I feel like we all kind of touched on this, but even reevaluating how we hire professors, and it's tricky, right? Because often, again, the labor of how do we fix institutions falls back on faculty of color, right? And so if that is the case, we need to get paid for that work. We need to be acknowledged for that work. Even, you know, organizing an event like this, right? Like that takes a lot of labor. And so I would say, one, thinking about our hiring policies, like I know so many great people, anxious folks of color, critical folks of color that are trying to get a job, but for whatever reason, right, they're not getting hired. And so this whole BS of, well, there just isn't any X type of person, or it's just not a good fit. We need to really reevaluate how we hire faculty, and then you need to pay us for the work we do.
One last question or comment?
Hi everyone. It's for Miss Alma Flores. I want to say thank you so much. Your presentation was eye-opening for me personally, because when I was in high school, I didn't know much about minorities, you know, and white were like on the top. As I started college, I went to community college, and then I transferred here, and this is my first semester here, by the way. Thank you. So like you said, like there are like health issues as you go to, like, you know, higher education level. I mean, that's how I'm feeling right now. So I had no issues when I was in high school, you know. So as I started to go community college, and as I study in the classroom here, and I have been acknowledging, I mean, like, I have been told that I belong to minority group, you know, and like these like white people, like they are the men, they are like, you know, they are on the top, and we have been like health issues, like other minorities groups, and that's really eye-opening for me. And it was, I mean, I was here for the extra credit, by the way, so I mean, it was just for 6 points, but after your presentation, it was like I got like 600 points. I'm really, really happy. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Alrighty, so that concludes our panel presentation. Thanks once again to all of our amazing panelists. Thank you for sharing your insights on the continuing educational inequalities and colonial processes, right, that are still embedded in our educational institutions. Thank you all, students, for coming. Thank you for our student volunteers, our staff. I hope we can continue to have these kinds of conversations on campus, and hope to also have your support for the kind of work that we're doing as Chris J, as the Task Force for the Center on Race, Immigration, and Social Justice. Thank you all. Thank you.